born on the 4th of July, Maureen Brubaker Farley, was always jokingly described as a, quote, firecracker. The eldest of 7, Maureen was often put in charge of her younger siblings and watched over them with pride and care. Sometimes her parents, knowing the amount of stress she was bound to endure, when left alone with her 6 siblings, offered each one a bribe. Maureen's mother would give each younger child 10 cents apiece, a hefty sum in the 1960s, in exchange for their promise to mind their manners. For their eldest sibling, Maureen was born and raised in Sioux City, Iowa. Maureen moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in order to be geographically closer to her new husband, David, who was serving time in the Anamosa State Penitentiary, with the cost of making a phone call to her family being sometimes fiscally important. Maureen would take care to mail pictures of her life back home to her 4 brothers and 2 sisters who, along with their parents, eagerly awaited any news of the eldest child. Living on her own and working in Cedar Rapids, Maureen was impressing everyone with her ability to keep her life on track, despite impediments. Maureen was last seen alive at 5:30 p.m. on Friday, September 17, 1971, after she uncharacteristically neglected to show up for her shift at the diner. She worked for a local joint named Vita's Restaurant, located at 836 First Avenue Northeast, and later neglected to pick up her paycheck. Her boss reported to authorities as missing. On September 24, 1971, 2 teenage boys out hunting and exploring the area approached the trunk of what they believed to simply be an abandoned, dilapidated vehicle. Kevin Coppice, 15, and Danny Lineweaver, 14, first saw what they believed was a sleeping woman. They thought she was resting because of how she was positioned across the trunk, with one of her legs propped up and her back perched against the rear window. Not wanting to disturb the woman, they continued on their way. But on their walk back home, they decided to make a closer inspection, and that's when they realized the true horror. The 2 boys approached the car and realized the sleeping woman was actually the lifeless body of 17-year-old Maureen, who had been carelessly thrown atop the car's trunk. The grisly discovery was traumatic for all involved. Babies finding babies, the locals lamented. 3 children in essence, all exposed to trauma far beyond their years. Her body had been stealthily stowed in a wooded ravine located off of La Road Southwest, near the local dump and what is now Tate Cummins Park. The medical examiner ruled that Maureen's body had been there for, quote, no less than 48 hours and no more than 96 hours. She was partially undressed and was shoeless, but investigators noted that she had clean feet, which police said was evidence that Maureen's body had been moved. Post-mortem, her cause of death was a basal skull fracture, a crack in the base of her skull caused by a brutal blunt force trauma to the head. Autopsy results also showed that she had been sexually assaulted, with Maureen's life cut short far too soon by an unknown and brutal killer still at large. Many of the citizens in the community believed that the small-town police squad was ill-equipped and improperly trained for such a large-scale murder investigation, resulting in the stalling of progress in Maureen's case. Her sister Lisa recalls that, in the confusing and depressing aftermath of her sister's murder, that her family felt cut out of the investigatory process. Feeling helpless, Lisa and Maureen's mother sent a letter to Cedar Rapids police nearly 6 months after her eldest daughter's body had been found, in which she detailed important information she believed police were ignoring. She wrote that she believed a man named George Smith was responsible for her daughter's death. Maureen's mother specified in her letter that George was not a friend of Maureen's, but was known to her due to the proximity of his work to her home, as he was a cashier at a convenience store near Maureen's apartment. Well, police did interview George Smith during the course of their inquiry in 1971. They did not have enough hard evidence with which to charge him or any other suspect, for that matter for her murder. In the ensuing decades, Maureen's case grew cold, and while the dead girl's mother insisted that she knew the truth, she could not produce any concrete evidence that would put George behind bars, hoping that the case was going to be solved simply through allowing time for technology to catch up to the needs of the victim. Police again tested the crime scene evidence in 2009, but to no avail in the years that passed. Maureen's father would die with no answers to what happened to his eldest daughter, and hoping that unfortunate fate would not also befall her mother, too. In 2013, Maureen's family members created a Facebook page called Remembering Maureen Brubaker Farley, aimed at keeping the case alive in hopes that it would someday be solved. In those ensuing and lonely years, Lisa recalls of her grieving and aging mother, quote, "Whenever anybody passed from this world, my mom said, well, now they're up in heaven with Maureen, and they must be happy and they must know the answers." But Lisa continued on by providing her own take on the matter, saying, quote, "I just didn't want to wait that long. I didn't want us to wait until we go on to the next world. I wanted answers in this world." And on October 5th, 2021, Maureen's family finally got the news that they had been waiting for, when police announced that Maureen's mother's hunch had been correct the entire time. Investigators had preserved and been able to recreate DNA profile from artifacts left at the crime scene, and after procuring DNA samples from the list of initial suspects, they were able to find a match. Lisa and Maureen's mother had waited for this confirmatory news for half a century. 5 decades after Maureen's body was found, the Cedar Rapids Police Department Cold Case Unit was able to conclusively link George M. Smith to the crime scene by utilizing DNA technology, which was not in existence in the 1970s. Unfortunately, the case was closed without the ability to prosecute, as George Smith, never charged nor arrested, was able to peacefully pass away at the ripe old age of 94 in 2013, a luxury not afforded to his teenage victim Maureen. The tragic taking of her sister from her and her family inspired Lisa to eventually join law enforcement in 1991, and she worked her way up to the position of sheriff. Lisa, upon finding out that her mother's suspicions were correct, says, quote, "There was so much collateral damage, heartache from Maureen's death. Although her life was just one life, it affected so many for so long." In late September of 1941, light cruiser HMS Sydney was operating on the west coast of Australia. She was tasked with escorting convoys from Fremantle to the Sunda Strait in Indonesia. On November 17, 1941, after escorting its most recent trip ship to its destination, Sydney made its return journey to Fremantle. 2 days later, on November 19, 1941, and around 4 p.m., the crew of the Sydney spotted what they believed to be a merchant ship on the horizon. As very few merchant ships were allowed in the area, at the time the captain of the Sydney, Joseph Burnett, demanded the signal that the merchant ship identify herself. The merchant ship identified itself as a Dutch ship, Straat Malacca. However, Straat Malacca was not allowed to be in the area. At that time, the Sydney then sent a signal, ordering the ship to show her secret call sign. But despite repeated attempts, the merchant ship did not show the secret call sign. Thinking something was off, the captain of the Sydney decided to intercept. The merchant ship was not the Straat Malacca that it had claimed to be. It was actually a disguised and heavily armed German merchant raider ship called the Cormoran. The Cormoran had already sunk 10 ships in the Indian Ocean. As the Sydney drew closer to investigate the ship, the Cormoran opened fire. Although the Sydney was a far superior ship than the merchant ship, the surprise attack caused it to miss its first salvo, while the cormorants hit the Sydney. What followed was a 30-minute battle, with both ships mortally damaging each other. The Sydney later sank, and almost all of the 645 men on board died in that fight. The crew of the Cormorant, on the other hand, abandoned the ship. 318 of their crew members survived, while only 81 died. The surviving German crew members were later captured by Australian vessels and became prisoners of war. A search for the sunk vessel found no sign of the ship, except for a single empty life raft, known as a Carly float, and an inflated RN life jacket. A few months later, on February 6, 1942, on the coast of Christmas Island, local authorities found a decomposing body on a Carly float. The broiler suit the man had been wearing was originally blue, but had been bleached white due to the sun. Not much is known about the autopsy results, as most of it was destroyed or lost during the Japanese occupation of Christmas Island. Despite a number of attempts, the body could not be identified, as it had no dog tags, nor any items that could help identify him. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Christmas Island Cemetery. In the post-war years, after much speculation that the unidentified man's body had come from the HMS Sydney in 2006, the man's body was exhumed, and his remains were examined, and DNA samples were taken. The man was believed to be between 22 and 31 years old when he died, and between 5'6" and 6'2" in height. He died possibly from a fragment of shrapnel being embedded in his skull. In the next few years, investigators put all resources available into identifying the man. Using dental records, they were able to narrow down the list to 50 members of the HMS Sydney crew. His DNA would later be submitted to genealogy databases, and on November 19, 2021, exactly 80 years later, the man was identified as able seaman Thomas Wesley Clerk. Thomas was born on January 28, 1920 in Brisbane, Queensland. His elder brothers served in the Army, and in the Air Force. Thomas decided to join the Royal Australian Naval Reserve on August 23, 1940, after training at the HMS St. Giles. He was promoted as acting able seaman in July of 1941. He then went on a further training mission on HMS Serbius before joining the HMS Sydney. He was on board the HMS Sydney for 2.5 months before it sank. The HMS Sydney's wreckage was found in 2008, but no other bodies on board were ever able to be recovered. On June 27, 1992, the dismembered remains of a woman was discovered in a dumpster behind the I Love New York pizza restaurant on Midland Avenue in Yonkers, New York, by a construction worker looking for a lost lottery ticket. Her remains were found in plastic bags within the dumpster. An autopsy revealed that she died 1 day prior to her body being found. Both the victim's arms had been severed, along with her right leg, and as a result, the police were unable to administer fingerprints in order to identify her. The victim had a hole in the back of her head from an axe or a similar weapon. Police were unable to determine if she had been sexually assaulted. The victim had a tattoo of a butterfly on her right shoulder and a scar on her left thigh. She was believed to be a heavy smoker and had cesarean scars, suggesting that she had at least one child. It was believed that the woman was white or possibly Hispanic. Police believed that the woman was a prostitute and a transient, as she had not been reported missing. Despite a number of attempts, police were unable to identify the victim. It would take police a few years before they linked the case to one Robert Schulman. Robert Schulman was a serial killer who was active from 1991 to 1996. Schulman was a postal worker who picked up prostitutes in New York City. and took them to his apartment in Hicksville, Long Island. He would then smoke crack cocaine with them. Before bludgeoning them to death, he would then dismember the women's bodies and dispose of their parts throughout Long Island, Manhattan, and Yonkers. Schulman was arrested on April 6, 1996, after a sex worker tipped the police off. Schulman confessed to murdering 5 women, including the Yonker Jane Doe. Schulman said that, after taking the woman back to his apartment, they both smoked crack cocaine. He says that he then blacked out and woke up to find the Jane Doe dead, after which he dismembered her and dumped her remains in a dumpster in Yonkers. Schulman was sentenced to death in 1999. However, he was sentenced to life in prison. His brother was also sentenced to 2 years in prison for helping him dispose of one of the bodies. The woman that Schulman murdered included Lori Vasquez, Lisa Ann Warner, Kelly Sue Bunting, as well as 2 unidentified women, the Yonker Jane Doe and the Medford Jane Doe. Schulman died in prison in 2006 of an undisclosed cause. Even though Schulman confessed to the murder, he did not remember the names of the victims, and the names of the 2 unidentified victims remained a mystery. In 2014, Detective John Dice of the Yonkers Cold Case Squad reopened the Yonker Jane Doe case and asked forensic genealogist and artist Carl Koppelman to make a 3D render of the victim. In 2001, detective guys contacted the FBI, and the DNA from the victim was entered into genealogy databases nationally. Just 3 weeks later, the FBI found a potential match to the victim's cousin. Detective guys then flew to Michigan and met with the victim's possible sister and 2 brothers. They gave DNA samples and identified the victim from the photo and the butterfly tattoo. A DNA test later confirmed the victim was indeed their missing sister, Marissa Hammonds. On December 7, 2021, Carl Koppelman posted on his Facebook page stating that he had the family's permission to share details about Marissa. Quote, "She was born in Kentucky in April of 1961 and was one of 7 siblings. She spent much of her early years living in California. When she was older, she moved to Michigan and then to New Jersey, where she and her sister worked as fashion models. Marissa was a mother of 2, but estranged from her family at the time of her death. Marissa was identified after 29 years. The Medford Jane Doe remains the only unidentified victim of Robert Schulman. She is described as being 5'2", 5'1", and around 135 pounds, with brown eyes and reddish-brown hair, which could have been dyed. She had a tattoo of a red heart with a white banner, which reads Adrian on her left shoulder.